The Wyoming wind cut through the valley like a blade that morning, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and something that made Samuel Hayes pause on his front steps, coffee mug halfway to his lips. 43 years of living on this land had taught him to read the signs, and today felt different. Wrong somehow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His weathered hands gripped the ceramic handle tighter as he scanned the horizon. The Tetons loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks shrouded in gray clouds that seemed to press down on the world below. Not a soul moved across the vast expanse of his property, yet Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from somewhere beyond the fence line. The sensation had been growing stronger for weeks now. Cattle going missing. Strange tire tracks near the eastern boundary. Tools disappearing from the barn, only to turn up in places he'd never left them. At first, he'd chalked it up to his imagination, a lonely man's mind playing tricks after two. Many quiet evenings with only the coyotes for company. But this morning, as he stood on the wraparound porch of the ranch house his grandfather had built in 1892, Samuel knew something was coming. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, the way it did before a tornado touched down. He'd lived through enough storms to recognize the signs. The screen door creaked behind him, and he turned to see Elena Martinez emerge, dustcloth in hand. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. Her slight frame belying the strength he'd witnessed over the past 3 months she'd worked for him. Dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. Wearing the same faded blue dress she rotated with 2 others, the only clothes she seemed to own. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," she said softly, her voice carrying just a trace of an accent that spoke of childhood. Summers in New Mexico with her grandmother. "I'll start with the kitchen today, if that's all right." Samuel nodded, noting how she avoided his gaze. She always did that, looked past him, around him, anywhere but directly at him. In 3 months, he'd learned precious little about Elena Martinez, beyond her name and the fact that she worked harder than any 3 ranch hands he'd ever employed. She'd appeared at his door on a Tuesday in late March, soaked to the bone from an unexpected spring storm, asking for work in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. Something about her desperation had struck him, not the desperation of someone lazy looking for easy money, but the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been running for a very long time. Samuel had hired her on the spot, despite having no real need for household help. The ranch house had been echoing empty since Martha's passing 4 years ago, and he'd grown accustomed to the silence, the dust, the slow decay of a home without a woman's touch. But Elena had brought something back to life in these old walls. Something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Now, watching her disappear into the house, Samuel noticed what he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. The limp. It was subtle, so slight that most people wouldn't catch it, but it was there. A barely perceptible favor of her right leg, a careful placement of each step, as if she were walking on broken glass. He'd first noticed it during her 2nd week, when she'd been hanging laundry on the line behind the house. The way she'd shifted her weight, the small wince that crossed her features when she thought no one was looking. Samuel had chalked it up to the long hours on her feet, the demanding physical work of maintaining a house this size, but it had been getting worse, not better. And Elena never complained, never asked for rest, never so much as mentioned any discomfort. She simply worked through it with a stoicism that both impressed and troubled him. The coffee had gone cold in his hands, but Samuel barely noticed. Through the kitchen window, he could see Elena moving about her morning routine, wiping down counters, organizing the dishes he'd left scattered about, bringing order to the chaos of a man who'd forgotten how to properly care for his own home. She was sweeping now, the old straw broom making soft scratching sounds against the hardwood floors. Martha had insisted on installing when they'd first married. Elena's movements were methodical, efficient, but Samuel found himself focusing on her feet, on the way she shifted her weight with each stroke of the broom. There she did it again. That subtle adjustment, that careful redistribution of weight, that spoke of pain she was trying to hide. Samuel set down his mug and walked closer to the window, his brow furrowing with concern. Elena was bent over now, sweeping dust into a pile near the kitchen table. The morning light streaming through the gingham curtains caught her profile, highlighting the concentration on her features. She was pretty, Samuel realized with a start, not in the flashy way of the women who frequented the saloons in town, but in a quiet, enduring way that reminded him of the wildflowers that bloomed in the high meadows each spring. The thought made him uncomfortable. He had no business noticing such things about his employee, especially one young enough to be his daughter. Elena couldn't be more than 25, while Samuel had turned 43 last November, marking the occasion alone with a bottle of whiskey and memories of better times. But there was something about her that drew his attention beyond mere physical beauty, an inner strength that showed in the set of her shoulders, the determined line of her jaw. She reminded him of a wounded bird that refused to show its injury, still trying to fly despite the pain. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and Samuel's attention snapped back to the horizon. Those storm clouds were moving closer, their dark bellies pregnant with rain and possibly hail. He'd need to get the cattle into the lower pasture before it hit, secure anything loose around the property. But first, he wanted to check on Elena. Something was wrong, had been wrong since she'd arrived, though he'd been too polite or too afraid to pry. Martha had always said he was too soft-hearted for his own good, taking in every stray cat and injured bird that wandered onto their property. Maybe Elena was just another wounded creature he'd instinctively tried to shelter. Samuel made his way around to the kitchen door, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He could hear Elena inside, humming softly to herself, a melody he didn't recognize, something sad and beautiful that seemed to carry the weight of untold stories. The kitchen door stood open to let in the morning air, and Samuel paused at the threshold. Elena was still sweeping, her back to him, completely absorbed in her work. The light from the window fell across her in golden strips, creating patterns that shifted as she moved. That's when he saw it. At first, Samuel thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A trick of the light, perhaps, or a shadow cast by the old kitchen table. But as Elena took another step, adjusting her weight in that careful way she'd perfected, Samuel saw it clearly. Blood. Not much, just a few drops on the worn wooden floor where she'd been standing. Dark red spots that stood out starkly against the pale oak Martha had scrubbed to a honey-colored shine decades ago. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Elena seemed unaware of the trail she was leaving, her attention focused entirely on her sweeping. But with each step, each careful placement of her right foot, a small crimson drop appeared on the floor behind her. His mind raced through possibilities. An injury she was hiding? Some kind of medical condition? The limp suddenly took on a more sinister meaning, transforming from a minor concern into something that made his stomach clench with worry. Samuel cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Elena?" She spun around, the broom clattering to the floor. For a split second, her face was completely unguarded fear, pain, and something else he couldn't quite identify flashing across her features before she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in. Is there something you need?" Her voice was steady, professional, but Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she bent to retrieve the fallen broom. And now that he was looking for it, he could see other signs he'd missed before, the careful way she held herself, the slight pallor beneath her olive complexion, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Elena," Samuel said gently, taking a step into the kitchen. "You're bleeding." Her eyes flew to the floor, taking in the small drops of blood she'd left behind. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, Samuel thought she might faint. She gripped the broom handle so tightly her knuckles went white. "It's nothing," she said quickly, already moving toward the utility closet where the cleaning supplies were kept. "Just a small cut. I'll clean it up right away." But Samuel had noticed something else now, something that made his blood run cold. As Alina moved toward the closet, her right foot left a more pronounced mark on the floor. Not just a drop of blood, but a small, wet footprint tinged with red. The blood wasn't coming from a cut on her hand or arm. It was coming from her foot, seeping through her worn leather shoe with each step she took. "Elena, stop." Samuel's voice was firmer now, touched with the authority he used when dealing with spooked horses or stubborn cattle. "Sit down. Let me see what's wrong." "Really, Mr. Hayes, it's nothing. I can. Sit down." The command brooked no argument, and Elena slowly sank into one of the kitchen chairs, still clutching the broom like a lifeline. Samuel could see the effort it took for her to appear calm, the way she fought to keep her breathing steady despite the obvious pain she was in. Samuel knelt beside her chair, his movements slow and non-threatening. Elena's eyes were wide, watching his every move like a rabbit cornered by a predator. Up close, Samuel could see more signs of distress, the slight sheen of perspiration on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. The way she held her right leg slightly elevated to take pressure off her foot. "Elena," Samuel said softly, "I need you to trust me. You're hurt, and I want to help. But I can't do that if you won't let me see what's wrong." For a long moment, they looked at each other across the small kitchen that had suddenly become charged with tension. Samuel could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the windows and sending loose branches scraping against the siding. The storm was getting closer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena's lips parted as if she were about to speak, then closed again. Samuel could see the war playing out behind her dark eyes, the desperate need for help battling against whatever had taught her to hide her pain, to suffer in silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You won't understand. Try me." Elena looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. When she spoke again, her words came out in a rush, as if she were afraid that stopping would rob her of the courage to continue. "I worked for a family before I came here. The Washingtons, down in Colorado Springs. Big house, lots of land, like this place. Mrs. Washington was ... She was sick a lot. Stayed in bed most days. Mr. Washington, he ... double quote." She paused, swallowing hard. "He said I reminded him of his daughter, sighed I was family." Samuel felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the approaching storm. He'd heard stories like this before, whispered conversations in town about certain men who took advantage of young women in their employ. The kind of stories that made decent people look away and pretend they hadn't heard. "Elena," he said carefully, "did he hurt you?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly. Not the way you're thinking. He was ... kind at first. Gave me extra money, little gifts. Said I was special, that he cared about me like a father." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I was stupid. I believed him." Samuel's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. "What happened to your foot, Elena?" Elena was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she might not answer. Outside, the first fat raindrops began to splatter against the windows, heralding the arrival of the storm he'd sensed coming all morning. When Elena finally spoke, her words were so quiet Samuel had to strain to hear them over the increasing patter of rain. "Mrs. Washington found out about the gifts. About how her husband looked at me, talked to me. She ... she blamed me. Sighed I was trying to steal her husband, break up her family. Elena's hands were shaking now, the careful composure she'd maintained for months finally beginning to crack. She had these shoes made, special shoes with things inside them. Said if I was going to be a homewrecker, I should feel what it was like to walk on broken glass every day. Samuel's stomach dropped. What kind of things? Elena's voice was barely audible now. Metal, sharp pieces of metal sewn into the sole. She made me wear them every day, said if I took them off or complained, she'd tell everyone in town that I was a whore who tried to seduce her dying husband. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of rain beginning to drum against the roof. Samuel stared at Elena, his mind struggling to process what she'd just told him. The careful way she walked, the limp that had been getting worse, the blood seeping through her shoes, it all made horrifying sense now. "Elena," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion, "how long have you been wearing those shoes?" 6 months, she whispered. "Every day for 6 months." Samuel felt something hot and violent rise in his chest, a rage so pure and fierce it took his breath away. The idea of someone deliberately causing pain to this young woman, day after day, month after month, made him want to ride to Colorado Springs and settle things the old-fashioned way. But Elena needed help now, not revenge. The storm outside was picking up intensity, rain lashing against the windows with increasing force. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a fitting soundtrack to the revelation that had just shattered the peaceful morning. "We need to get those shoes." "Off you," Samuel said, rising to his feet. "Right now." Elena shrank back in her chair. "No, you don't understand. If I take them off, she know. She has people watching, people who tell her things. If she finds out I'm not wearing them ... Elena." Samuel's voice was firm, but gentle. "Look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. "You're not in Colorado Springs anymore. You're on my land, in my house, under my protection. Whatever power that woman had over you ends here, today." Elena's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. "You don't know her. You don't know what she's capable of." "Then tell me," Samuel said. "But first, we're getting those instruments of torture off your feet before you lose them to infection." The thunder was closer now, and the kitchen had grown dim as the storm clouds blocked out the morning sun. Samuel moved to light the oil lamp on the counter, its warm glow pushing back the shadows that seemed to be gathering in the corners of the room. When he turned back to Elena, she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope, maybe, mixed with fear and something that might have been gratitude. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Samuel thought of Martha, of the promises he'd made to her before she died. To be kind to those who needed kindness, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, to be the kind of man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Because it's right," he said simply. "And because no one should have to walk on broken glass just to survive." Outside, the storm finally broke in earnest, sending sheets of rain against the windows and filling the air with the electric charge that comes before lightning. Inside the kitchen, Samuel Hayes and Elena Martinez sat facing each other across a divide that had suddenly become much smaller. The first drops of blood on the wooden floor, marking not just her pain, but the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find in the isolated wilderness of Wyoming. Trust, the foundation upon which everything that followed would be built. The storm outside had transformed from gentle rain into a full Wyoming tempest with wind howling through the eaves and lightning illuminating the kitchen in stark, flickering bursts. Samuel moved to the cabinet above the sink, retrieving a bottle of whiskey and clean rags while Elena sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "This is going to hurt," Samuel warned gently, kneeling beside her chair with his supplies. "But keeping those contraptions on your feet will hurt worse in the long run." Elena nodded mutely, her hands gripping the wooden arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Samuel had delivered calves in blizzards, set broken bones on ranch hands miles from the nearest doctor, and stitched up more wounds than he cared to count. But he'd never felt his hands shake the way they did now as he reached for Elena's right foot. The leather of her shoe was worn thin, cracked along the sides where her foot had swollen from constant irritation. Dark stains marked places where blood had seeped through and dried, creating a mottled pattern that spoke of months of hidden agony. Samuel could see how she'd tried to reinforce the worn spots with needle and thread, desperate attempts to make the torture bearable without removing the source entirely. "Elena," Samuel said softly, his fingers hovering over the laces, "I need you to tell me about Mrs. Washington. What kind of woman forces another person to endure this?" Elena's voice came out in broken whispers between lightning crashes. "Victoria Washington. Everyone in Colorado Springs thought she was a saint. Donated to the church, organized charity drives for the poor, always had a kind word for the shopkeepers." She laughed bitterly. But in private, behind closed doors, she was different. Samuel began working at the knots in her shoelaces, noting how they'd been tied and retied so many times the leather had begun to fray. Different how? Jealous, possessive. She couldn't stand the thought that anyone might take her husband's attention away from her, even though she barely spoke to him most days. When she got sick with the consumption, it got worse. She started seeing threats everywhere, enemies in every shadow. The first lace came free, and Elena gasped as the slight loosening of pressure sent new waves of pain through her foot. Samuel paused, giving her a moment to breathe before continuing with the second lace. "The first girl before me was named Sarah," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she talked. "Mrs. Washington accused her of stealing jewelry that later turned up in the woman's own jewelry box. Sarah ran out of town with nothing but the clothes on her back." "And you stayed, knowing this?" Elena's eyes met his, and Samuel saw the complex mix of emotions there: shame, defiance, and something that might have been regret. "I needed the work. My mother had taken ill back in Santa Fe, needed medicine I couldn't afford on what I was making at the boarding house. The Washingtons paid 3 times what anyone else would, and I thought I could handle whatever came." The second lace came undone, and now only the tight leather of the shoe itself held the hidden torture device against Elena's foot. Samuel could see her steeling herself for what came next, drawing on reserves of strength that had sustained her through 6 months of deliberate cruelty. "Mrs. Washington discovered the gifts her husband had been giving me on a Tuesday morning in January," Elena said, her voice taking on the detached quality of someone recounting a nightmare. "Little things: a hair ribbon, a book of poetry, a brooch that had belonged to his mother. I tried to refuse them, but he insisted, said it made him happy to see me happy." Samuel worked his fingers under the edge of the shoe, feeling the swollen, tender flesh beneath. Elena's entire foot was inflamed, the skin hot to the touch even through the thin cotton of her stocking. What happened when she found them? She came into my room without knocking, started going through my things like I was a criminal. When she found the gifts hidden in my trunk, she she went mad. Started screaming that I was a seductress, a home wrecker, that I bewitched her dying husband with feminine wiles. Lightning struck close enough to rattle the windows, and in the brief illumination, Samuel could see the pain etched deep in Elena's features. Not just physical pain, but the soul-deep hurt of someone who'd been blamed for circumstances beyond her control. "She dragged me downstairs to confront her husband," Elena continued. "Made me stand there while she accused me of all manner of wickedness. Mr. Washington just sat there, said nothing in my defense. Just watched while his wife destroyed my reputation with every word." Samuel began to ease the shoe off Elena's foot, moving with the patience of a man who'd learned that rushing only made things worse. The leather resisted, stuck to her skin with dried blood and infection, but gradually it began to slide free. "That's when she came up with the punishment," Elena whispered. Said if I wanted to stay and continue earning my wages, I'd have to prove my repentance. Prove that I understood the pain I'd caused her marriage. The shoe came off with a wet, tearing sound that made Samuel's stomach clench. What he saw beneath made him close his eyes for a moment, fighting back a wave of nausea and rage that threatened to overwhelm him. Elena's foot was a mass of infected wounds and torn flesh. The metal pieces Mrs. Washington had sewn into the shoe had done their work with brutal efficiency. Small, sharp fragments of steel that had been cutting into the bottom of her foot with every step for 6 months. Some wounds had tried to heal around the metal, creating raised, angry scars. Others remained open, weeping sores that spoke of the body's inability to recover from constant re-injury. "Dear God," Samuel breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "Elena, how did you walk at all? You learn," she said simply. "You learn to change your gait, to shift your weight, to find ways to keep going because stopping isn't an option." She looked down at her ruined foot with a detached curiosity, as if seeing it clearly for the first time in months. "I told myself every day that it would get better, that I just had to endure a little longer." Samuel reached for the whiskey, his hands steadier now that action was required. "This is going to burn like hellfire," he warned, "but we need to clean these wounds before infection takes hold." Elena nodded, gripping the chair arms again. "I felt worse." The whiskey hit the open wounds, and Elena's back arched, a sharp cry escaping her lips before she bit down hard on her lower lip to muffle any further sounds. Samuel worked quickly but thoroughly, cleaning away months of accumulated infection and debris while Elena trembled with the effort of staying still. "Tell me about leaving," Samuel said, partly to distract her from the pain and partly because he needed to understand the full scope of what she'd escaped. "What finally made you run?" Elena's breathing was ragged, but she managed to speak between waves of pain. Mrs. Washington got worse as the months went on. The consumption was eating her alive, and she became convinced that her suffering was somehow my fault. She started making the shoes worse, adding more metal, sharper pieces. Samuel paused in his cleaning, looking up at her face. "Worse how?" She found a piece of broken glass from a whiskey bottle her husband had thrown against the wall during one of their fights, ground it up into tiny slivers, and sewed those in too. Elena's voice broke slightly. "Said it was fitting, since I was the reason for their fighting." The scope of the cruelty was breathtaking. Samuel had seen his share of hard people during his years on the frontier, but the calculated nature of Victoria Washington's torture went beyond anything in his experience. This wasn't the desperate violence of someone cornered, or the explosive rage of someone pushed too far. This was deliberate, methodical, designed to cause maximum suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. "The night I left," Elena continued, "I overheard her talking to her sister who'd come to visit. She was planning to have me branded like cattle. Said the shoes weren't enough anymore, that I needed a permanent mark so everyone would know what kind of woman I was." Samuel's hands stilled completely. "Branded? With an iron? She'd had one made by the blacksmith, told him it was for marking. Leather goods. But I saw the design, it was the letter W for whore. She planned to hold me down and press it into my shoulder so I'd carry the mark for life." Thunder rolled overhead, so close now that the entire house seemed to shake with each crash. Samuel finished cleaning Elena's foot and reached for the clean rags, his mind racing with the implications of what she'd told him. A woman sick with consumption, driven mad by jealousy and pain, with enough money and social standing to make her word law in a small town. Elena had been trapped in a nightmare with no apparent escape. "So you ran," Samuel said, beginning to wrap her foot with careful precision. "I took nothing but the clothes I was wearing and the few dollars I'd managed to hide away. Left in the middle of the night during a thunderstorm. Walked for 3 days before I found a town where I could buy passage on a northbound stage." Elena winced as Samuel secured the bandage, but her voice was growing stronger. I was so afraid. She'd send people after me, that I'd wake up one morning to find her men dragging me back. Samuel tied off the bandage and moved to Elena's left foot, though he could already see that this shoe had been less damaging. The leather was in better condition, and there were no obvious blood stains. Still, he wanted to check for hidden injuries. Why Wyoming? He asked as he worked at the second set of laces. As far from Colorado Springs as I could get with the money I had. And I'd heard that ranch folk minded their own business, didn't ask too many questions about someone's past. Elena managed a small, weak smile. Turns out I was half right. The second shoe came off much easier, revealing a foot that was sore and blistered, but mercifully free of the metal fragments that had tortured her right foot. Samuel cleaned and bandaged it as well, noting the way Elena's entire body seemed to relax as the pressure was finally, completely removed. "There," Samuel said, gathering up the bloody rags and the horrific shoes that had caused so much pain. "Those instruments of torture will never touch your feet again." Elena stared down at her bandaged feet, tears flowing freely now. "I don't have any other shoes," she said quietly. "These were all I had." Samuel stood, his knees protesting after the long time spent kneeling on the hard kitchen floor. "Martha was about your size. I kept her things in the chest upstairs. There'll be shoes that fit you, and dresses too if you want them." The mention of his dead wife seemed to break something loose in Elena, and she began to sob in earnest, great, wrenching cries that spoke of months of suppressed pain and fear finally finding release. Samuel stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure whether comfort would be welcome, before gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said firmly. "Whatever power that woman had over you, whatever hold those people had on your life, it ends. Here, on my land, in my house, you're safe." Elena looked up at him through her tears, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude, but the first tentative stirrings of hope, the possibility that life might hold something other than pain and fear outside. The storm was beginning to pass, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a steady patter rather than the driving deluge it had been. The worst was over, both outside and within the warm confines of the kitchen, where two people had shared truths that changed everything. But Samuel knew that storms, once they'd passed, often left destruction in their wake. And somewhere to the south, in a grand house in Colorado Springs, a sick woman with too much money and not enough conscience might already be planning to reclaim what she considered her property. The real battle, Samuel realized as he helped Elena to her feet and supported her weight as she took her first pain-free steps in 6 months, was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the storm that changed everything, and Elena Martinez was learning to walk again. Not just physically, though the daily ritual of changing bandages and applying salve to her healing wounds marked each sunrise, but emotionally, spiritually, in ways she was only beginning to understand. Samuel had moved her belongings from the tiny servants' quarters behind the kitchen to Martha's former sewing room on the second floor. It was a bright space with 2 large windows facing east, where morning light streamed across polished hardwood floors and painted the whitewashed walls gold. Elena had protested the move initially, insisting she was just hired help and didn't deserve such accommodations. But Samuel had cut through her objections with quiet firmness. "You're not a servant in this house," he'd said, carrying her few possessions upstairs despite her protests. "You're a guest who happens to help with the chores. There's a difference." The room came with unexpected treasures. Martha's cedar chest held not just clothing dresses in soft cottons and warm wools, undergarments still fragrant with lavender sachets, shoes in supple leather that felt like silk against Elena's healing feet, but also books. Dozens of them, tucked away in the bottom of the chest like buried treasure. Elena discovered Martha Hayes had been a voracious reader. Poetry by Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, novels by Charles Dickens and George Eliot, botanical guides too. The Flora of the American West, even a worn copy of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's writings on women's suffrage. Each book bore the careful marginalia of an active mind, questions, observations, agreements and arguments penned in neat handwriting that revealed a woman of intelligence and strong opinions. She was self-educated, Samuel explained one evening. When Elena asked about the collection, they were sitting on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the Tetons, while Elena read aloud from a volume of Robert Frost. Grew up poor in Illinois, never had formal schooling past the age of 12. But she was determined to learn, bought books whenever we could spare the money. Elena ran her fingers along the worn spine of the poetry collection, imagining Martha Hayes reading these same pages by lamplight after long days of ranch work. She sounds remarkable. She was. Samuel's voice carried the particular quality grief takes on after years of practice, not raw anymore, but still tender to the touch. Always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Once you had it. The observation lodged itself in Elena's mind, germinating over the following days as she threw herself into Martha's library with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. During the daylight hours she continued her household duties, though Samuel insisted she take frequent breaks to rest her healing feet, but evenings found her curled in the window seat of her room, reading by oil lamp until her eyes grew heavy. Books had been forbidden luxuries during her months with the Washington family. Victoria Washington viewed reading as idleness, time that could be better spent scrubbing floors or polishing silver. Books fill girls' heads with foolish notions, she'd proclaimed, confiscating the single volume of Shakespeare's sonnets Elena had brought with her from Santa Fe. Make them think they're above their station. Now surrounded by Martha's collection, Elena felt as though she were awakening from a long sleep. The poetry spoke to something in her soul that had gone quiet during those dark months in Colorado. Springs. The botanical guides opened her eyes to the world outside the ranch house windows. She learned the names of the wildflowers that carpeted the meadows, understood the complex relationships between the plants and animals that shared this high mountain valley. But it was the books on women's rights that truly set her mind ablaze. Reading Stanton's arguments for female suffrage, her passionate pleas for women to be recognized as full human beings rather than property, Elena felt pieces of herself clicking back into place. She began to understand that what had happened to her in the Washington household wasn't personal failing or divine punishment, but part of a larger pattern of how society allowed men to treat women as possessions rather than people. Samuel noticed the change in her immediately. Where once Elena had moved through the house like a ghost, apologizing for her presence and speaking only when spoken to, she now engaged in conversations that stretched long into the evening. She asked questions about the ranch, about Wyoming, politics, about Samuel's experiences serving in the territorial legislature before Martha's illness had called him home. "You're different," he observed one evening as they worked together in the kitchen, Elena kneading bread while Samuel cleaned his rifle at the table. It had become their routine practical tasks performed in comfortable companionship while they talked. Elena paused in her kneading, flour dusting her forearms to the elbows. "Different how? Stronger, more present, I suppose. Like you're finally living inside your own skin instead of just borrowing it." The metaphor was more accurate than Samuel knew. For months, Elena had felt disconnected from her own body, viewing it as something separate from herself, a vessel for pain that she endured rather than inhabited. The daily torture of the metal-spiked shoes had taught her to retreat inward, to exist as much as possible in the realm of thought and memory where physical suffering couldn't reach. But healing changed everything. As her feet grew stronger and the constant pain receded, Elena found herself rediscovering the simple pleasures of embodied existence. The satisfaction of kneading bread, feeling the dough transform beneath her hands from rough and sticky to smooth and elastic. The joy of walking barefoot across cool grass in the early morning, her feet finally free to feel texture and temperature without the filter of agonizing wounds. "I'm remembering who I used to be," Elena said finally, returning to her kneading. With renewed vigor. "Before the Washingtons, before everything. I used to love learning, used to ask questions about everything. My grandmother in Santa Fe always said I had too much curiosity for my own good." Samuel smiled at that, the expression transforming his weathered features in a way that made Elena's heart skip unexpectedly. "Martha would have liked you. She always said curiosity was the sign of a mind that was truly alive." The mention of Martha should have created awkwardness between them, but instead it felt natural, appropriate. Elena had come to think of Martha not as a rival or obstacle, but as a predecessor, a woman who had loved this land and this man and left her mark on both in ways that continued to nurture and protect even after death. It was during the 4th week of Elena's recovery that the first letter arrived. Samuel found it tucked under a rock on the fence post nearest the main road, weighted down against the persistent Wyoming wind. The envelope was expensive paper, cream-colored, with a monogram embossed in gold initials that made Elena's blood run cold when Samuel brought it into the kitchen. "View," Elena read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria, Washington." Samuel's face darkened as he turned the envelope over in his hands. "Addressed to you." How did she know where to find you? Elena sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unsteady despite weeks of healing. She has money. Money buys information, especially in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. She stared at the letter as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "I knew this day would come. I just hoped. I hoped I'd have more time." "You don't have to read it," Samuel said firmly. "We could burn it right now, pretend it never came." But Elena was already reaching for the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the wax seal. "No, I need to know what she wants, what she's planning. Ignorance won't protect me from whatever comes next." The letter was written in Victoria Washington's precise, elegant handwriting, the penmanship of a woman educated in the finest finishing schools, trained to create beauty, even when expressing ugliness. "My dear Elena, I trust this letter finds you in good health, though I confess myself surprised by your sudden departure from our household. After all, we provided for you shelter, employment, the opportunity to serve a family standing in the community. Your abandonment of your duties was both unexpected and deeply hurtful. I write not in anger, but in concern for your welfare. A young woman alone in the world faces dangers she may not fully comprehend, especially one who has developed certain unfortunate tendencies toward inappropriate behavior with married men. I fear that without proper guidance, you may find yourself in situations that compromise both your safety and your reputation. Therefore, I am prepared to offer you redemption. Return to Colorado Springs within 1 month's time, and I will welcome you back into our household. Your previous indiscretions will be forgiven, your position restored. You need only acknowledge your mistakes and commit to conducting yourself with the proper humility befitting your station. However, should you choose to remain in your current circumstances, living unmarried in the household of a man not your husband, a situation that can only lead to scandal and ruin, I will be forced to take steps to protect both your reputation and that of the innocent man you are undoubtedly deceiving with your presence. I have taken the liberty of making inquiries about your current situation. Mr. Samuel Hayes appears to be a man of good character, who has been led astray by feminine wiles he is too gentlemanly to recognize. It would be tragic if his reputation in the community were to suffer because of his misguided charity toward a woman of questionable virtue. You have 1 month to make the correct choice. I pray you will choose wisely, with Christian concern for your immortal soul, Mrs. Victoria Washington. Elena read the letter twice before passing it to Samuel, with hands that shook despite her efforts to control them. She watched his face darken as he absorbed the veiled threats and manipulative language, saw the muscles in his jaw clench as he reached the end. "Well," Samuel said finally, his voice deceptively calm, "that's quite a piece of work." "She means every word," Elena said. "The threat about your reputation isn't idle. She spreads stories, get people talking. In a small community like this, that kind of gossip can destroy a man's livelihood." Samuel crumpled the letter in his fist, his control finally slipping. "Let her try. I've lived in this valley for over 20 years, built my reputation through hard work and honest dealing. If people want to believe the word of some sick woman from Colorado over what they know about me personally, then they weren't worth knowing in the first place." But Elena could see the worry in his eyes, the understanding that reputation, once damaged, was difficult to repair. Samuel needed the goodwill of his neighbors for everything from cattle sales to help during emergencies. A man branded as morally compromised would find himself isolated in landscape where isolation could mean death. "I should leave," Elena sighed quietly. "Tonight, before she has a chance to follow through on her threats. I can take the evening stage to Denver, disappear again, find somewhere else to start over." "No," Samuel's voice was sharp, decisive. "Running won't solve this. That woman wants to control you, and control requires proximity. The farther you get from her reach, the less power she has." Elena shook her head. "You don't understand. She doesn't just want me back, she wants to win. To prove that nobody defies Victoria Washington and gets away with it. If I stay here, she'll find ways to hurt both of us. Then we need to be ready for whatever she sends our way." Over the following days, Samuel proved true to his word. He rode into town to speak with Sheriff Benjamin Cooper, a grizzled veteran of range wars and territorial disputes who listened to Elena's story with grim attention. Cooper agreed to keep watch for strangers asking questions about Elena and to investigate any suspicious activity around the ranch. Samuel also reached out to his neighbors, not with gossip or explanation, but with the practical request for mutual aid that was standard practice in ranch country. He organized a barn raising for the Johnsons whose storage shed had been destroyed in a late spring storm, volunteered to help the Petersons move their cattle to summer pasture, offered the use of his best bull to any neighbor whose herd needed improving. "Politics," he explained to Elena as they watched a dozen men work to raise the frame of the Johnsons' new barn. "In ranch country, a man's word is his bond, and his bond is proven through actions, not promises. If Victoria Washington wants to poison the well against me, she'll find the water's already been tested and found pure." Elena watched Samuel work alongside his neighbors, saw the easy camaraderie and mutual respect that marked his relationships with the other ranchers, and understood that she was witnessing something Victoria Washington couldn't buy or manipulate. Genuine community built on years of shared struggle and mutual aid. But she also noticed the questions in some of the women's eyes, the careful way they evaluated her presence at Samuel's side. Not hostile exactly, but curious, measuring, wondering about the nature of the relationship between the widowed rancher and his young housekeeper. Mrs. Johnson approached Elena during the barn raising, her manner friendly but probing. "Samuel tells us you've been helping him get the house back in order. Must be quite a job. That man never did learn to take proper care of domestic things." "He's been very kind to me," Elena replied carefully. "Gave me work when I needed it." "Most, course he did." Samuel always had a soft heart for strays. Mrs. Johnson's smile took any sting out of the words, but Elena caught the underlying message. She was being categorized, placed in the mental file of women who needed rescuing rather than women who might be suitable partners for a man of Samuel's standing. It was a reminder that even here, in this place that had offered her sanctuary, she remained an outsider. Her past would always be a question mark, her presence always slightly suspect. Victoria Washington's threats carried weight precisely because they played on existing social anxieties about unmarried women, about the proper boundaries between Men and women, about the thin line between charity and impropriety. That evening, as they rode home from the barn raising, Elena shared her observations with Samuel. "Mrs. Johnson thinks I'm one of your strays." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was setting behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold. "Does that bother you?" "It bothers me that Victoria Washington was right about one thing: my presence here could damage your reputation. These people have known you for 20 years, but they don't know me at all. If rumors start spreading ... Elena." Samuel reined in his horse, forcing her to stop as well. In the fading light, his expression was serious but not unkind. "I didn't invite you to stay because it was convenient or safe or socially acceptable. I invited you to stay because it was right, because every person deserves the chance to heal from whatever wounds they carry. But your reputation, my reputation, will survive whatever gossip Victoria Washington wants to spread. But I'm not. Sure, I could survive watching you run away again, knowing I had the power to help and chose safety instead." The words hung between them in the cooling air, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Elena felt her heart racing, not with fear this time, but with something far more dangerous: hope mixed with longing, the treacherous emotion she'd taught herself to suppress during the months of survival. "Samuel," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the complex feelings swirling through her chest. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too. Whatever this is growing between us, we both know it's more than charity on my part or gratitude on yours." Elena's breath caught. During the weeks of recovery, she'd found herself noticing things about Samuel that had nothing to do with his kindness or protection. The way his hands moved with unconscious grace when he worked with leather or wood. The sound of his laughter when something genuinely amused him. The patient intelligence in his eyes when he listened to her read aloud from Martha's books. "What do we do about it?" she asked. Samuel urged his horse forward again, and they continued toward home in thoughtful silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "We take it one day at a time. See where it leads us. But Elena, whatever happens between us, it has to be your choice. Free choice, made by a woman who knows her own mind and has other options available. You mean I have to be able to leave before I can truly choose to stay?" Something like that. It was a conversation that would replay in Elena's mind over the following days as she continued to heal, continued to discover who she was becoming in this new place. Samuel's words echoed Martha's marginalia in the suffrage books: the idea that real choice required real alternatives, that freedom meant nothing if it wasn't genuine. But freedom, Elena was learning, came with its own challenges. As her physical wounds healed and her emotional strength returned, she found herself facing questions she'd never had the luxury of considering during her months of mere survival. Who was she when she wasn't defined by someone else's expectations or cruelty? What did she want from life beyond safety and basic dignity? The questions became more urgent when the second letter arrived. This one not hidden on a fence post, but delivered directly to the front door by a well-dressed stranger who claimed to be passing through on business. Elena watched from the window as Samuel accepted the envelope, saw the way his shoulders tensed as he recognized the handwriting. This letter was shorter, the tone more direct. "Elena, your month is nearly up, and I have received no word of your intentions. I can only assume that your continued silence indicates a willful rejection of my generous offer of redemption. Therefore, I am dispatching my nephew, James Washington, to collect you and return you to your proper place. James is a capable young man who understands the importance of family reputation and the need to correct situations that reflect poorly on our good name. You may come willingly, acknowledging your mistakes and accepting the consequences of your poor choices. Or you may resist, in which case James has my full authority to use whatever means necessary to ensure your return. Your choice But the outcome remains the SAMEV. Washington. Elena stared at the letter, ice forming in her veins despite the warmth. Of the kitchen. James Washington. I know him. Samuel looked up sharply. Victoria's nephew. Her brother's son. 25 years old, big as a mountain, and mean as a rattlesnake. He used to visit the house sometimes when Mrs. Washington was feeling particularly vindictive. She'd have him discipline. The help when she felt someone needed a stronger hand than hers. He hurt you? Elena nodded, touching her ribs unconsciously where James Washington's fists had left bruises that took weeks to heal. He enjoyed it. Said women needed to know their place, and sometimes that required a firm hand. Samuel's face went very still, the kind of stillness that preceded either an explosion or deadly action. When? He's probably already on his way. Could be here within days, maybe sooner if he pushed hard and changed horses frequently. Elena stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out at the peaceful ranch yard where chickens pecked in the dirt and cattle grazed in distant pastures. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal when measured against the storm she knew was coming. I won't go back, she said quietly, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Whatever it costs, whatever happens, I won't let them drag me back to that house. Samuel joined her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring at her shoulder. Then we make sure they can't. How? James Washington isn't some hired gunman you can face down in a fair fight. He's family, with legal papers and probably a sheriff's deputy or two bought and paid. If he says I'm a runaway wife or a thief, who's going to believe my word against his? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities and problems. When he spoke, his voice was calm but determined. We're going to town tomorrow. Time to call in some favors and make sure the right people know the whole story before James Washington arrives with his version. Elena turned to face him, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Not just protectiveness, but partnership. The look of a man who'd made a decision and was prepared to see it through regardless of the consequences. Samuel, you could lose everything. Your ranch, your reputation, maybe even your freedom if this goes wrong. He reached out, his fingers briefly touching hers where they rested on the windowsill. I already lost everything once when Martha died. Thought that was the end of my story, that I'd just mark time until my own end came. His eyes met hers, steady and sure. You changed that, brought life back into this house, into my world. I'm not giving that up without a fight. Outside, storm. Clouds were gathering on the horizon once again, dark and ominous against the evening sky. But this time, Elena didn't feel the helpless dread she'd carried for so many months. This time, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. She felt ready to fight back. The town of Cedar Ridge had been Samuel's anchor for over 2 decades, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around the intersection of 2 cattle trails that had grown into something resembling civilization. Main Street stretched for 3 blocks, lined with the essential businesses that kept ranch life viable. Brennan's General Store, Murphy's Saloon, the First Bank of Wyoming Territory, Doc Henley's medical practice, and the modest courthouse where Judge Harrison presided over disputes ranging from cattle rustling to property boundaries. Samuel had helped build half these establishments, his carpentry skills supplementing ranch income during the lean early years when every dollar counted. He knew every merchant, every family, every story that made up the intricate web of relationships that sustained a frontier community. But as he and Elena rode down Main Street on that crisp October morning, Samuel saw his hometown through different eyes, calculating which allies he could count on, which neighbors might waver under pressure, which institutions would stand firm against outside influence. Elena sat straight-backed in Martha's old riding dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes and gave her an air of quiet dignity. The transformation from the broken woman who'd appeared at his door was so complete that Samuel sometimes had to remind himself they were the same person. Her dark hair was pinned up in the fashion Martha had favored, and she wore Martha's garnet. Earrings, small touches that proclaimed her place in Samuel's household without requiring explanation. "Tell me about Sheriff Cooper," Alina said as they approached the jail, her voice steady despite the gravity of their mission. "Can we trust him to listen before he judges?" Samuel considered the question carefully. Benjamin Cooper had served as sheriff for 12 years, elected and re-elected on a platform of fair dealing and practical justice. He was a former cavalry officer who'd stayed in Wyoming after his discharge, married a local woman, raised 3 children who'd grown up alongside Samuel's neighbors' kids. Cooper's reputation was built on the understanding that law enforcement in ranch country required more diplomacy than gunplay, more common sense than legal technicality. "Ben's a good man," Samuel said finally. "Honest, fair-minded, not easily swayed by money or pressure. But he's also practical. If James Washington shows up with legal papers claiming you're a runaway wife or indentured servant, Ben will have to consider that seriously. Even if those papers are lies?" "Papers don't lie, Elena. They just don't always tell the whole truth." The distinction was crucial, and Samuel could see Elena absorbing its implications as they dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, Victoria. Washington was wealthy enough to buy legal documents that would give her nephew's actions the appearance of legitimacy. In a territory where law was still evolving and federal oversight was minimal, the right paperwork could carry more weight than testimony or evidence. Sheriff Cooper emerged from his office as they approached, his weathered face creasing into a smile of genuine welcome. He was a tall man, lean and hard from years of frontier life, with graying hair and eyes the color of winter sky. His handshake was firm, his manner direct but not unfriendly. "Samuel, good to see you. And this must be Miss Martinez." Cooper touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "I've been expecting you both." Elena's surprise must have shown on her face because Cooper chuckled. News travels fast in a small town, especially when it concerns folks people care about. "Sam here's been asking questions, making preparations. Doesn't take much imagination to figure out why." They followed Cooper into his office, a spare room dominated by a heavy oak desk and walls lined with wanted posters and territorial statutes. Coffee simmered on a pot-belly stove in the corner, filling the air with the rich aroma that was the unofficial scent of frontier law enforcement. "Before we start," Cooper said, settling behind his desk while Samuel and Elena took the chairs opposite, "I want you both to understand something. I've been a sheriff for 12 years, and I've learned that most problems have more than one side to them. I aim to hear all sides before I make judgments." Elena nodded, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I appreciate that, Sheriff Cooper. I know my story is difficult to believe. Ma'am, I've been in law enforcement long enough to know that the most difficult stories to believe are often the truest ones. Evil has a way of disguising itself as respectability, especially when it's got money behind it." Cooper's words seemed to unlock something in Elena, and she began to speak with a clarity and confidence that impressed Samuel. She told the sheriff about her employment with the Washington family, about the gifts from Mr. Washington that had triggered his wife's jealousy, about the escalating cruelty that had culminated in the metal-spiked shoes. She spoke without self-pity or embellishment, presenting facts with the precision of someone who'd learned that emotional appeals were often dismissed while hard evidence carried weight. When she finished, Cooper sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes, his fingers steepled as he processed what he'd heard. Finally he spoke. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. If this James Washington shows up here with papers claiming legal authority over you, what kind of proof can you offer that those papers are fraudulent?" Elena's composure wavered slightly. I don't have papers, Sheriff. I never thought to get copies of anything, never imagined I'd need to prove. That's the problem, Cooper said gently. In the eyes of the law, lack of documentation often favors whoever has the most official-looking paperwork. If James Washington shows up with a marriage certificate claiming you're his uncle's wife, or an indenture contract saying you owe labor, to the family my hands might be tied. Samuel leaned forward. Ben, you've known me for 20 years. Have I ever lied to you, ever given you reason to doubt my word? Never, Sam. Not once. But personal character doesn't always trump legal documentation, especially when territorial judges get involved. The weight of their situation was becoming clear. Victoria Washington's wealth and connections gave her access to legal mechanisms that could override local discretion. Even if Sheriff Cooper believed Elena's story completely, he might be powerless to protect her if confronted with official-looking documents backed by territorial authority. There might be another way, Cooper said slowly, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Miss Martinez, you said you worked for the Washington family for how long? 8 months total, 6 months wearing those shoes. And during that time, did you receive wages? Were there other servants who witnessed your treatment? Elena's eyes brightened slightly. There were wages, yes. Mrs. Washington insisted on paying me personally. Said it was important that I understand who held power over my circumstances. She always made me sign a receipt. Do you remember the amounts? The dates? Every dollar. I had to account for every penny I spent. Explain every purchase. Mrs. Washington said it was necessary to ensure I wasn't being wasteful with money I hadn't earned. Cooper exchanged a meaningful look with Samuel. Financial records create paper trails. If we can establish that you were a paid employee rather than family property, it undermines any claim that you're a runaway wife or indentured servant. But those records are all in Colorado Springs, Elena pointed out. How would we access them? Leave that to me, Cooper said. I've got friends in law enforcement down south, men who know how to ask the right questions in the right places. Give me a few days, and I might be able to get copies of employment records that prove your status. Samuel felt a surge of hope, but tempered it with realism. What about James Washington? If he's already on his way, we might not have days. Cooper stood, moving to a cabinet where he retrieved a telegraph form. That's why we're sending some messages right now. I'm going to wire my contacts in Colorado Springs, get them asking questions about the Washington family. Sometimes the best defense against wealthy bullies is shining light on their activities. As Cooper composed his telegrams, Elena turned to Samuel with an expression of cautious optimism. Do you think it will work? It's a start, Samuel replied. Carefully. But we need to prepare for the possibility that legal maneuvering won't be enough. Some problems can't be solved with paperwork. Cooper looked up from his writing. Sam's right. Miss Martinez, I need to ask you directly if James Washington shows up here claiming legal authority to take you back to Colorado Springs, and I can't find grounds to refuse him, what are you prepared to do? Elena's answer came without hesitation. I won't go willingly, Sheriff. I'd rather die than return to that house. The stark declaration hung in the office air like smoke from a gunshot. Cooper nodded slowly, understanding the implications. In that case, we better make sure it doesn't come to that choice. After leaving the sheriff's office, Samuel and Elena made their way to Brennan's General Store, the informal hub of local gossip and community information. Patrick Brennan had run the establishment for 15 years, and his wife Mary served as the unofficial social coordinator for everything from church socials to barn raisings. If Samuel wanted to ensure the right version of Elena's story reached the community before James Washington arrived with his own narrative, the Brennans were crucial allies. The store was busy with the usual mix of ranchers, townspeople, and travelers. But conversation died when Samuel and Elena entered. Not from hostility, but from the kind of respectful curiosity that marked frontier communities where everyone's business was potentially everyone's concern. Mary Brennan emerged from behind the counter, her round face creased with genuine warmth. She was a motherly woman in her 50s who'd never had children of her own, but had adopted every young person in the territory as a surrogate family. Her approval or disapproval could make or break a newcomer's acceptance in the community. "Samuel Hayes, you're looking well," Mary said, embracing him with the familiarity of old friendship. "And this must be the young lady who's been helping you put your house back in order." Alina stepped forward, extending her hand with quiet confidence. "Elena Martinez, Mrs. Brennan. It's a pleasure to meet you." Mary took Elena's hand in both of hers, studying her face with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read character quickly and accurately. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because her smile broadened. "Well, aren't you a pretty thing? And those manners, someone raised you right." Mary's approval was evident in her voice. "Sam's told me you've been working wonders with that old house. About time someone brought it back to life." The casual acceptance in Mary's tone was exactly what Samuel had hoped for. In frontier communities, personal endorsement from respected figures like Mary Brennan carried enormous weight. If she accepted Elena as legitimate, others would follow her lead. "Mrs. Brennan," Elena said carefully, "I wonder if I might ask your advice about something. I find myself in a rather difficult situation, and I'm not sure how to handle it properly." Mary's expression sharpened with interest and concern. "Of course, dear. What's troubling you?" Elena launched into a carefully edited version of her story, focusing on the facts that would resonate with a frontier woman's understanding of hardship and survival. She spoke of losing her position in Colorado Springs due to false accusations, of finding refuge at Samuel's ranch, of her fear that her former employers might pursue her with demands for her return. As Elena spoke, other customers in the store began to drift closer, drawn by the kind of compelling personal drama that broke the monotony of frontier life. Samuel watched their faces, gauging reactions, pleased to see more sympathy than suspicion in their expressions. "Those poor dear," Mary said when Elena finished. "Some people just can't stand to see others get ahead, especially women who show a bit of independence." She turned to address the gathered customers. "Sounds to me like Elena here escaped from a bad situation and found herself a good one. That's the kind of grit we respect in this territory." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Samuel recognized the psychology at work. Mary Brennan had just framed Elena's story in terms the community could understand and admire. Instead of a mysterious stranger with a questionable past, Elena had become a plucky survivor who'd overcome adversity through courage and hard work. Patrick Brennan emerged from the stockroom, his arms full of supplies for Samuel's order. Was a shorter, more practical version of his wife, with the kind of straightforward manner that came from years of successful business dealings. "Samuel, heard you might be expecting some unwelcome visitors," Patrick said without preamble. "Anything the community should know about?" Samuel appreciated his old friend's directness. "Might be some folks from Colorado Springs asking questions about Elena, people with more money than sense, trying to cause trouble for no good reason." "Well," Patrick said, setting down his armload and fixing Samuel with a steady look, "seems to me that troublemakers from out of territory have no business stirring up problems for our folks. The community has a right to protect its own." The statement was carefully neutral but loaded with meaning. Patrick was signaling that the local business community would support Samuel and Elena against outside interference, a crucial advantage. If James Washington tried to pressure local institutions. As they completed their business at the store, Elena drew Samuel aside. "They're being very kind, but I can see the questions in their eyes. They're wondering about us, about our relationship." Samuel nodded. Small communities survive on shared information. People need to know where everyone stands, who can be counted. On who might be a problem. They're measuring you, but from what I can see, you're passing the test. What if James Washington arrives with a different story? What if he claims I'm a runaway wife or that we're living in sin? Then we deal with that when it happens. But Elena, you need to understand something. Samuel's voice was serious, his eyes holding hers steadily. Whatever story James Washington tells, whatever claims Victoria Washington makes, the people in this community are going to judge based on what they see with their own eyes. You've been living in my house for weeks now, working alongside me, participating in community events. They can see for themselves what kind of person you are. Their next stop was the church, a modest wooden structure that served as both spiritual center and community meeting place. Reverend Thomas Mitchell was a pragmatic man who'd learned to balance Christian ideals with frontier realities, understanding that survival often required flexibility in the application of moral principles. Mitchell was working in the small garden behind the church when they arrived, his sleeves rolled up as he harvested the last vegetables before the first hard freeze. He was a man in his 40s, lean and weathered, with intelligent eyes and a kind of quiet authority that came from shepherding a flock through genuine hardships. "Samuel, Elena," Mitchell said, straightening from his work and wiping soil from his hands. "I've been hoping you'd come by. I understand there might be some challenges ahead." Elena looked surprised. "Reverend, I don't want to involve the church in my problems. I know my situation is complicated." Mitchell smiled, his expression gentle but firm. "My dear, the church exists precisely to support people through complicated situations. Besides, I've seen how you've cared for Samuel, how you've brought life back to that house. Christian charity is measured by actions, not circumstances." The Reverend's acceptance carried particular weight in a community where religious approval could determine social standing. His willingness to publicly support Elena would make it much harder for James Washington to paint her as a woman of questionable morals. "Reverend," Samuel said, "there might be someone coming from Colorado Springs, making claims about Elena's past, trying to force her to return to a situation that was harmful." Mitchell's expression darkened. "I see, and you're concerned about how the community might react to accusations from outsiders. Something like that." The Reverend was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving between Samuel and Elena with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to reading human nature. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of moral authority. "I've been ministering to frontier communities for 15 years, Mitchell said. "I've learned to distinguish between sin and survival, between moral failing and practical necessity. What I see before me is a woman who's found sanctuary and a man who's provided it. If someone wants to make that into something sordid, they'll have to explain their reasoning to me personally." As they walked back toward their horses, Elena seemed lost in thought. Finally she spoke. "They're all being so kind, so supportive. But Samuel, what if James Washington is right? What if my presence here does damage your reputation, hurts these good people who are trying to help us?" Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Elena, do you remember what you told me about Martha's books? About education being something nobody could take away once you had it? Yes, well, respect works the same way. The respect these people have for me was built over 20 years of honest dealing, fair treatment, and mutual support. If that can be destroyed by one stranger's accusations, then it wasn't worth having in the first place." Elena studied his face, seeing the quiet conviction that had first drawn her to trust this man. "You're risking everything for someone you barely know." "I know enough," Samuel said simply. "I know you're brave enough to walk on broken glass for 6 months rather than give up hope. I know you're kind enough to care about my reputation more than your own safety. I know you're strong enough to stand up to bullies who think money gives them the right to own other people." He paused, his voice growing softer. "And I know that Martha would have liked you, would have wanted me to do exactly what I'm doing, The mention of Martha should have created awkwardness, but instead it felt like a blessing, a connection between past and present that gave their current situation deeper meaning. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that she had found something she'd never dared hope for, not just safety, but belonging. "Samuel," she began, then stopped as the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them from the main road. 3 riders crested the hill leading into town, their horses lathered with the sweat of hard travel. Even at a distance, something about their bearing set Samuel's instincts on edge. These weren't local ranchers or casual travelers. They rode with the purposeful determination of men on a mission. "Is that?" Elena's voice was barely a whisper. Samuel squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make out details of the approaching riders. The man in the lead was large, broad-shouldered, sitting on his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through physical intimidation. Behind him rode 2 smaller men, but their posture suggested they were no less dangerous. "Could be," Samuel said grimly. "We better get you somewhere safe while I find out for certain." But Elena surprised him by shaking her head, her jaw set with determination. "No more hiding, Samuel. No more running. If that's James Washington, then it's time to face whatever comes next." As the riders drew closer, Samuel could make out more details. The lead rider was indeed a big man, probably in his 20s, with the kind of arrogant bearing that came from never having faced serious consequences for his actions. He wore expensive clothes travel-stained from hard riding, and his eyes swept the town with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing territory. "James Washington," Elena said quietly, confirming Samuel's fears. "He's exactly as I remembered him." The 3 men reined in their horses at the edge of town, their arrival noted by several townspeople who'd emerged from shops and businesses to observe the strangers. James Washington's gaze found Elena almost immediately, and his lips curved in a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Well, well," James called out, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Elena Martinez. You've led us quite a chase, girl, but all roads end eventually." Samuel stepped slightly in front of Elena, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. "Mister, I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Samuel Hayes, and this is my land you're riding on." James Washington's smile widened, showing teeth like a wolf's. "Samuel Hayes. Yes, I've heard about you. The lonely widower who takes in strays." His gaze flicked dismissively over Samuel before returning to Elena. "Well, Mr. Hayes, I'm here to collect something that belongs to my family. This conversation doesn't concern you." "Everything that happens on my land concerns me," Samuel replied evenly. "And Miss Martinez is under my protection." James Washington laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Protection? From what, old man?" "From her lawful obligations. From the people who fed and sheltered her when she had nothing." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I have legal documents here that say otherwise." Samuel felt Elena tense beside him, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "I know what those papers say, James. I also know they're lies built on lies. I'm not going back." "Oh, but you are," James Washington said, his tone suddenly cold. "And dangerous. One way or another, you're coming back to Colorado Springs. The only question is whether you walk to the horse or get tied across it." The threat hung in the air like the promise of violence, and Samuel felt the familiar calm that always preceded action settle over him. Around them, he could sense the townspeople watching, measuring, deciding where their loyalties lay. "Mr. Washington," Samuel said quietly, "I believe you're making a mistake. This is Wyoming territory, not Colorado. Your authority ends at the state line." James Washington's face darkened. "We'll see about that, Hayes. We'll see about that." As the confrontation escalated, Elena felt a strange sense of clarity descend over her. The months of fear, of running, of hiding, they had led to this moment. Standing in the dusty street of a Wyoming town, with a good man beside her and a community watching, she finally understood what Martha's suffrage books had been trying to teach her. Freedom wasn't something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something that had to be claimed, defended, fought for when necessary. And for the first time in her life, Elena Martinez was ready to fight. The tension in Cedar Ridge's Main Street was thick enough to cut with a knife. Word had spread with the supernatural speed that characterized frontier towns, and people emerged from shops, offices, and homes to witness what promised to be a reckoning years in the making. Samuel could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon them, could sense the community holding its collective breath as they waited to see how this confrontation would unfold. James Washington dismounted with deliberate slowness, his every movement calculated to demonstrate his physical superiority and intimidate opposition. He stood at least 6'4", with the broad shoulders and thick arms of a man who'd learned early that size could substitute for wit in most situations. His companions remained mounted, hands resting conspicuously near their weapons, a clear signal that they'd come prepared for violence if diplomacy failed. "Miss Martinez," James said, his voice carrying the mock courtesy that barely concealed threats, "I have here a sworn affidavit from Mrs. Victoria Washington stating that you departed her household without notice, taking with you personal items that don't belong to you." He withdrew a document from his leather portfolio, unfolding it with theatrical precision. "Additionally, I have a warrant from the Colorado Springs magistrate, authorizing your return to face charges of theft and breach of contract." Elena felt her stomach drop as she recognized the official-looking seals and stamps that marked legal documents in territorial jurisdictions. Victoria Washington's money had indeed bought her nephew impressive paperwork, the kind that could override local discretion and force even sympathetic officials to comply with demands. They personally disagreed with. Sheriff Cooper emerged from his office, having been alerted by one of the townspeople to the developing situation. His appearance was casual, but Samuel noticed the way Cooper's hand rested near his sidearm, the careful positioning that suggested he was prepared for this encounter to turn violent without warning. "Gentlemen," Cooper said, his voice carrying the authority of his office, "I'm Sheriff Benjamin Cooper. I understand there's some kind of dispute here involving one of our residents." James Washington turned to face the sheriff, his expression shifting to one of calculated respect, the look of a man who understood the value of appearing reasonable while pursuing unreasonable goals. "Sheriff Cooper, I'm James Washington, representing the Washington family of Colorado Springs. We're here on official business to recover stolen property and return a fugitive to face justice." "Fugitive?" Cooper's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious accusation. What crime is this young lady alleged to have committed?" James handed over the documents, watching Cooper's face carefully as the sheriff examined the papers. Samuel could see Cooper's jaw tighten as he read, could see the internal struggle between his personal beliefs and his professional obligations playing out in the older man's expression. "These papers appear to be in order," Cooper said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "They authorize the return of one Elena Martinez to Colorado Springs to face charges of theft and breach of employment contract." Elena stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her words. "Sheriff Cooper, those charges are false. I never stole anything from the Washington family. I left because Mrs. Washington was... because she was hurting. M.E. Now that's a lie," James Washington interjected smoothly, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man addressing a child's fantasy. "Elena has always been prone to dramatics, Sheriff. She was caught stealing jewelry from my aunt's bedroom, and when confronted, she created this elaborate story about abuse to deflect attention from her own crimes." Samuel watched the crowd's reaction to James's words, saw doubt beginning to creep into some faces. The man was skilled at manipulation, Samuel realized, He knew exactly how to present his version of events to maximize credibility while undermining Elena's truthfulness. "She's been living unmarried in this man's house for weeks," James continued, gesturing toward Samuel with obvious disdain. "Clearly she's found someone willing to believe her stories in exchange for companionship. But the law is the law, and these documents require her return." The implication was clear and deliberately inflammatory. James Washington was painting Elena as a woman of loose morals who'd traded sexual favors for protection, while positioning himself as the righteous agent of legal authority. It was a narrative calculated to exploit the moral sensibilities of a frontier community where reputation was currency and appearances mattered enormously. Samuel felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper now would only reinforce James Washington's narrative and potentially turn community sentiment against them. Instead, he addressed Sheriff Cooper directly. "Ben, you've had time to send those telegrams we discussed. Any word back from your contacts in Colorado Springs?" Cooper nodded slowly, understanding the direction Samuel was heading. "As a matter of fact, I did receive some interesting information this morning." He withdrew a telegram from his vest pocket, unfolding it deliberately. "Seems the Washington family has quite a reputation down south. 3 different servants have filed complaints in the past 2 years, all alleging mistreatment and excessive punishment." James Washington's confident demeanor flickered slightly. "Disgruntled employees, Sheriff. You know how it is, some people can't handle honest work and strict discipline." "Maybe," Cooper continued, "but I also received word from the Colorado Springs Bank. According to their records, Elena Martinez was paid regular wages for her work with the Washington family. Hard to prosecute someone for theft when you've got documented proof. They were a legitimate employee receiving agreed-upon compensation." The sheriff's revelation sent a murmur through the gathered crowd. Samuel could see people beginning to reassess the situation, could feel community sentiment starting to shift as Cooper's information contradicted James Washington's narrative. Elena seized the moment to speak, her voice growing stronger as she felt support building around her. "Sheriff, I can prove what really happened in that house." She sat down on the edge of the wooden sidewalk and began unlacing her boot, ignoring the shocked gasps from some of the women in the crowd. "Elena, what are you doing?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he knew. "Showing them the truth," Elena replied, pulling off her boot and then her stocking to reveal her right foot. Even weeks after Samuel had removed the metal fragments, the scars were clearly visible, a network of healed wounds and raised tissue that spoke of prolonged, deliberate injury. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Several women gasped audibly, while men muttered angry curses under their breath. Mrs. Brennan pushed forward, her motherly face twisted with outrage as she stared at Elena's scarred foot. "Dear God in heaven," Mrs. Brennan breathed. "What kind of monster does that to another human being?" Elena's voice was steady as she addressed the crowd. "Mrs. Victoria Washington had metal pieces sewn into my shoes, sharp fragments that cut into my feet with every step I took. She said it was punishment for accepting gifts from her husband, for being a temptation to a dying man who showed me kindness." The raw honesty of Elena's testimony, combined with the physical evidence of her scars, had a powerful effect on the assembled townspeople. Samuel could see faces hardening with anger, could feel the community's protective instincts awakening. As they realized they were witnessing the aftermath of genuine cruelty, James Washington, however, wasn't finished. "Anyone can acquire scars, Sheriff. Self-inflicted wounds designed to support a false narrative aren't unknown. Besides, even if this woman was disciplined for inappropriate behavior, that doesn't change the fact that she stole valuable jewelry before fleeing her legal obligations." "What jewelry?" Elena demanded, her temper finally flaring. "The hair ribbon your uncle gave me? The book of poetry?" The brooch that belonged to his mother that he insisted I take because he said it would. Make him happy to see me wearing something beautiful? James's face darkened. Those items belonged to the Washington family. Accepting them was theft, regardless of who offered them. No, said a new voice from the crowd. Accepting gifts from an employer might be improper, but it's not theft under territorial law. Everyone turned to see Judge William Harrison approaching, his black robes marking his official status. Harrison was a man in his 60s who'd served on the territorial bench for over a decade, building a reputation for fairness and legal precision that commanded respect throughout the region. Your Honor, James Washington said, his voice taking. On a new note of deference, I have legal documents here requiring this woman's return to Colorado Springs. Judge Harrison examined the papers carefully, his weathered face thoughtful as he read. When he finished, he looked up at James Washington with an expression that suggested professional skepticism. Mr. Washington, these documents allege theft and breach of contract. However, I see no specific inventory of stolen items, no monetary value assigned to alleged damages, and no evidence beyond accusation. Harrison's voice carried the authority of years on the bench. More importantly, the woman in question is standing before me with clear evidence of physical abuse that occurred while she was in your family's custody. Your Honor, I object to. You don't get to object in my jurisdiction, young man. Harrison interrupted sharply. You're not in Colorado Springs now, and these documents don't automatically supersede my authority to examine the facts of this case. The judge turned to Elena, his expression gentling. Miss Martinez, are you willing to swear under oath that the jewelry mentioned in these documents was given to you freely, without coercion or theft on your part? Elena straightened her shoulders, meeting the judge's gaze directly. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Washington gave me those items as gifts. I tried to refuse them, but he insisted, said it made him happy to see me wearing pretty things. And are you willing to swear that the injuries to your feet were inflicted deliberately by Mrs. Victoria Washington as punishment for accepting those gifts? Yes, Your Honor. She had the metal pieces sewn into my shoes by the cobbler, told him. It was for a special project. She made me wear them every day for 6 months, said if I complained or removed them, she'd have me branded as a whore. Judge Harrison's face grew grim. Sheriff Cooper, what's your assessment of this situation from a law enforcement perspective? Cooper stepped forward, his bearing formal as he addressed the court. Your Honor, based on my investigation and the physical evidence presented, I believe Miss Martinez has been the victim of systematic abuse and false accusation. The documents presented by Mr. Washington appear designed to legitimize what amounts to kidnapping and forced return to a situation of proven danger. I concur with Sheriff Cooper's assessment, Harrison said firmly. Mr. Washington, your papers may be legal in Colorado Springs, but they don't override this court's obligation to protect residents of this territory from obvious harm. James Washington's face flushed red with anger and frustration. You can't do this, Judge. Those are legal documents signed by a magistrate. And I'm a territorial judge with jurisdiction over this county, Harrison replied coldly. Unless you can provide evidence beyond mere accusation, this young woman will remain under the protection of Wyoming territory law. The crowd's approval was evident in the murmur of satisfaction that rippled through the assembled townspeople. Samuel felt a surge of relief, but he could see that James Washington wasn't prepared to accept defeat gracefully. This isn't over, James snarled, his mask of civilized behavior finally slipping to reveal the ugly reality beneath. My aunt has resources, connections you can't even imagine. She'll have federal marshals here within a week, and then your little territorial jurisdiction won't mean anything. Maybe, Judge Harrison said calmly, but until then, Miss Martinez remains a free citizen under my protection. I suggest you and your companions find lodging in town while you consider your next course of action. James Washington remounted his horse, his movements sharp with barely controlled rage. "You people have no idea what you're interfering with. Mrs. Washington doesn't forgive, and she doesn't forget. This girl belongs to our family, and we will have her back." "No," Elena said, stepping forward with a confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. "I don't belong to anyone. I'm not property to be owned or reclaimed. I'm a free woman making my own choices, and I choose to stay here." The declaration rang across the street with the clarity of a bell, and Samuel felt his heart swell with pride at Elena's courage. This wasn't the broken woman who'd appeared at his door months ago. This was someone who'd found her strength and refused to surrender it to bullies, regardless of their wealth or connections. James Washington stared at Elena for a long moment, his expression promising future retribution. Then he wheeled his horse and rode toward the hotel, his companions following. The immediate confrontation was over, but everyone understood it was merely a postponement, not a resolution. As the crowd began to disperse, individuals approached Elena to offer words of support and encouragement. Mrs. Brennan embraced her like a daughter, while Reverend Mitchell spoke quietly about the church's continued support. Even strangers who'd witnessed the confrontation stopped to shake her hand, expressing admiration for her courage in standing up to intimidation. Sheriff Cooper approached Samuel as Elena received the community's support. "Sam, this isn't over." James Washington meant what he said about federal marshals and higher authorities. "We've bought some time, but Mrs. Washington's money could still cause serious problems." Samuel nodded grimly. "What do you suggest?" "Get Elena legally established as a territorial resident. If she's got official status here, it makes it harder for outside authorities to simply drag her away. Also, document everything: her injuries, her employment history, testimony from witnesses. Build a case so strong that even federal intervention would have to acknowledge the facts." Judge Harrison joined their conversation, his expression thoughtful. "There's another option we should consider. Miss Martinez, have you given any thought to marriage?" Elena looked startled by the suggestion. "Marriage, Your Honor?" "A married woman gains certain legal protections, especially if her husband is an established territorial resident with property and standing in the community." Harrison's gaze moved meaningfully between Elena and Samuel. "It would make any attempt to remove you from Wyoming significantly more complicated." Samuel felt his heart racing at the judge's suggestion, but forced himself to remain calm. "That would have to be Elena's choice, Your Honor, and it would have to be a real marriage, not just a legal convenience." Elena looked at Samuel, her eyes searching his face for answers to questions she couldn't quite voice. The attraction between them had been growing for weeks, the emotional connection deepening through shared challenges and mutual support. But marriage was a permanent commitment, not something to be entered lightly even under dire circumstances. Could I have some time to think about it?" Elena asked quietly. "Of course," Samuel replied, though he could see James Washington watching them from the hotel porch, no doubt calculating his next move. "But don't take too long. Men like James Washington don't give up easily, and his aunt sounds even more determined." As they prepared to return to the ranch, Elena found herself torn between gratitude and uncertainty. The community's support had been overwhelming, the legal protection more than she'd dared hope for. But the suggestion of marriage raised questions about her feelings for Samuel, about the difference between gratitude and love, about whether she could trust her own emotions after months of trauma and healing. Samuel seemed to sense her internal struggle as they mounted their horses for the ride home. "Elena, whatever you decide about Judge Harrison's suggestion, I want you to know something. My offer of protection doesn't depend on marriage or any other legal arrangement. You have a home at my ranch for as long as you want it, no strings attached." His words were meant to reassure, but they only added to Elena's confusion. Samuel was offering her freedom without obligation, the very thing she'd been fighting for. But freedom, she was beginning to realize, wasn't just about escaping control. It was about choosing where to place your trust, where to invest your heart, where to build the life you wanted, rather than simply enduring the life imposed upon. As they rode through the Wyoming twilight toward home, both of them knew that the real test was yet to come. James Washington would return with reinforcements. Victoria Washington's wealth would buy new forms of pressure, and federal authorities might indeed arrive to challenge territorial jurisdiction. But for the first time since fleeing Colorado Springs, Elena felt genuinely hopeful about the future. She'd found her voice, discovered her strength, and earned the support of a community willing to stand against injustice. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone or defenseless. The question now was whether she was ready to risk her heart on something even more dangerous than legal battles or physical confrontation: the possibility of genuine love with a man who'd already proven he would sacrifice everything to protect her freedom to choose her own path. As the ranch house came into view, its windows glowing warm and welcoming in the gathering darkness, Elena made her decision. She would stay and fight, not just for her legal freedom, but for the right to build a life based on her own choices rather than other people's demands. The battle with Victoria Washington was far from over, but Elena Martinez was no longer the frightened woman who'd fled into the night. She was someone who'd learned to stand her ground, to speak her truth, and to believe that she deserved the happiness she was finally brave enough to reach for. The ride back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence, both Samuel and Elena lost in their own thoughts as the weight of the day's events settled over them. The October air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the Tetons. It was the kind of evening that usually brought Samuel peace, but tonight his mind churned with concerns about federal marshals, legal complications, and the impossible complexity of his feelings for the woman riding beside him. Elena's performance in town had been remarkable. Her transformation from the broken soul who'd appeared at his door to the confident woman who'd faced down James Washington in front of the entire community was nothing short of miraculous. But Samuel understood that courage in public moments was different from the private struggles that came afterward, when adrenaline faded and the full implications of one's choices became clear. Mrs. Washington said she'd been dismissed for theft, but Mary Catherine's belongings were still in her room. Her sister came looking for her a week later, said Mary Catherine would never leave without sending word to her family. Elena met Samuel's eyes, her expression haunted. "I think something terrible happened to her, Samuel. Something that went beyond just dismissal, or even normal cruelty." Samuel felt ice forming in his veins as the implications of Elena's words sank in. If Victoria Washington had progressed from systematic abuse to actual violence against servants who tried to resist or help each other, then Elena's escape represented more than just fleeing an abusive employer. It might have saved her life. "Elena, do you have any proof of what you suspect? Anything that could be investigated?" Mary Catherine's sister might remember details. Her name was Bridget O'Brien, lived in a boarding house on the east side of Colorado Springs. She was asking questions, threatening to involve the authorities if no one could explain her sister's disappearance. Elena paused, her expression growing more determined. If we're really going to expose Victoria Washington, Bridget O'Brien would be a crucial ally. Someone with a personal stake in seeing justice done. Samuel nodded, his mind already working through the logistics of contacting Mary Catherine's sister and building a broader case against the Washington family. But he also recognized that such an investigation would put Elena in even greater danger. Victoria Washington might view exposure of potential murder as sufficient justification for extreme measures to silence witnesses. "Elena, if we pursue this course, there's no going back. Victoria Washington will see us as existential threats rather than just inconveniences. Are you prepared for that level of conflict?" Elena was quiet for several minutes, staring into the flames dancing behind the stove's glass door. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom and carefully considered resolve. "Samuel, for months I believed that survival meant staying invisible, avoiding conflict, accepting whatever cruelties were necessary to maintain basic safety. But today, standing in that street facing James Washington, I realized something important." She turned to meet his gaze directly. Sometimes survival requires fighting back. Sometimes the only way to truly be safe is to make sure the people who hurt you can't hurt anyone else. Samuel felt his heart swell with admiration for Elena's courage, even as he recognized the dangers they would face together. "Then we'll fight back, together. But Elena, before we commit to a war with Victoria Washington, I need to know, are you willing to marry me? Not just for legal protection, but because you want to build a life together?" Elena moved closer to Samuel, close enough that she could see the reflection of lamplight in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool kitchen air. The question hung between them like a bridge across an uncertain chasm, requiring a leap of faith from someone who'd learned to distrust her own judgment about men, about love, about the future. "Yes," Elena said simply, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Samuel Hayes. Not because I need protection, not because I'm grateful for your kindness, but because I love you and I want to face whatever comes next as your partner." Samuel's smile was radiant as he reached for Elena's hands, drawing her close enough to rest his forehead against hers. "Then we'll face Victoria Washington together as husband and wife. And Elena, whatever she throws at us, whatever resources she brings to bear, she's never dealt with anyone like us before." "What do you mean?" "She's used to controlling isolated individuals, people who feel powerless and alone. But she's never fought a partnership built on genuine love and mutual respect, backed by a community that believes in justice over money." Samuel's voice grew stronger, more confident. "Victoria Washington thinks she owns people, treats them like property to be managed. She doesn't understand that free people fighting for each other are infinitely stronger than slaves fighting for masters." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of hope rather than sorrow. In Samuel's words, she heard the promise of something she'd never dared imagine, not just safety or even love, but true partnership with someone who saw her as an equal, valued her strength, and trusted her judgment. "When?" Elena asked. "When do we marry?" Samuel considered the practical implications of their decision. "Soon, tomorrow, if Judge Harrison is willing to perform the ceremony. The longer we wait, the more time Victoria Washington has to bring federal pressure to bear or send additional people to cause trouble." "Tomorrow," Elena agreed, feeling a flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. It seemed sudden, but then again, everything important in my life has happened suddenly, leaving Santa Fe, escaping Colorado Springs, finding you. "Finding each other," Samuel corrected gently. "And Elena, sudden doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones that feel right immediately, that don't require endless deliberation because they're so obviously correct." As they prepared for bed still in separate rooms, but with the knowledge that tomorrow would change everything, Elena reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a victim, powerless and afraid, enduring daily torture while clinging to the faint hope that survival was possible. Now she was preparing to marry a man she loved, planning to expose the woman who'd tormented her, and looking toward a future built on her own choices, rather than other people's cruelty. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It had required physical healing, emotional growth, the discovery of inner strength she hadn't known she possessed, and the support of a community willing to stand against injustice. But perhaps most importantly, it had required learning to trust herself again, to believe that her judgment was sound, her feelings were valid, and her dreams were worth pursuing. as Elena settled into Martha's former sewing room for what would be her last night as a single woman. She thought about the books that had opened her mind to new possibilities, about the suffrage writings that had taught her to see herself as a full human being rather than someone else's property. Tomorrow she would marry Samuel Hayes, but she would do so as Elena Martinez, a free woman making a free choice about her own life. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the promise of winter storms ahead, but inside the ranch house, warmth and light prevailed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and the beginning of a battle that would test everything Elena had learned about courage, love, and the price of freedom. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena fell asleep without fear, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it as part of something larger than herself, a partnership built on love, strengthened by shared purpose, and committed to ensuring that women like Mary Catherine O'Brien would never again disappear into the darkness of someone else's cruelty. Dawn broke over the Tetons with unusual clarity, as if the mountain air had been scrubbed clean overnight. Elena woke to the sound of Samuel moving around downstairs, preparing coffee and breakfast with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitary mornings. But today was different. Today was their wedding day, and the knowledge sent both excitement and nervous energy coursing through her veins. She dressed carefully in Martha's best dress, a deep green wool with pearl buttons that Elena had altered to fit her smaller frame. The fabric felt substantial against her skin, carrying with it the weight of history and the promise of a future built on foundations Martha Hayes had helped establish. Standing before the small mirror in her room, Elena hardly recognized the confident woman looking back at her. Gone was the frightened girl who'd fled Colorado. Springs in the dead of night, in her place stood someone ready to fight for the life she'd chosen. Downstairs, Samuel looked up from his coffee as Elena entered the kitchen, and his expression of quiet amazement made her cheeks warm with pleasure. "You're beautiful," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than elaborate compliments could have managed. "So are you," Elena replied, noting how Samuel had taken care with his appearance despite the early hour. His dark hair was neatly combed, his best shirt pressed, his manner carrying the gravity appropriate to a man about to make the most important commitment of his life. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts about the day ahead and the challenges that would follow. Judge Harrison had agreed to perform the ceremony at 10 o'clock in his chambers, with Sheriff Cooper and Mrs. Brennan serving as witnesses. It would be a simple affair, focused on legal formalities rather than social celebration, but Elena found she preferred it that way. The marriage was about commitment between two people, not public spectacle. "Samuel," Elena said as they prepared to ride into town, "there's something I need to tell you before we take our vows." Samuel paused in saddling his horse, hearing the serious tone in her voice. "What is it?" "I'm not the same person who arrived at your ranch months ago." That woman was broken, desperate, willing to accept whatever scraps of kindness came her way, because she didn't believe she deserved better. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "The woman marrying you today has expectations, dreams, plans for the future. She won't be satisfied with just survival. She wants to thrive, to make a difference, to build something meaningful." Samuel smiled, understanding what Elena was really telling him. "Good. I fell in love with your strength, not your vulnerability. I want a partner who challenges me, who has her own ambitions and opinions, who won't just follow my lead but will help chart our course together." Elena felt a surge of relief at Samuel's response, followed by a deeper sense of rightness about their decision. This man understood her in ways she was still learning to understand herself, valued her independence rather than feeling threatened by it. The ride into Cedar Ridge passed quickly, both of them eager to formalize the commitment they'd already made in their hearts. But as they approached the courthouse, Elena noticed something that made her stomach clench with apprehension. 3 unfamiliar horses were tied outside the building, their quality and tack suggesting riders with significant resources. Federal marshals. Elena realized with growing dread James Washington had made good on his threat. Inside the courthouse, the situation was exactly as Elena had feared. 3 men in dark suits stood conferring with a visibly uncomfortable judge. Harrison, their bearing marking them as federal officials accustomed to having their authority respected without question. James Washington stood beside them, his expression triumphant as he spotted Elena and Samuel entering the building. Miss Elena Martinez, one of the federal men said, stepping forward with an official-looking document. I'm Marshal Thomas Bradford, United States Marshal Service. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of theft, fraud, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Elena felt the familiar ice of fear in her veins, but this time it was tempered by anger and determination. She'd come too far, learned too much about her own strength, to surrender without a fight. Marshal Bradford, Judge Harrison interjected before Elena could respond. I've reviewed these documents, and I have serious concerns about their validity. The charges appear to be based on accusations rather than evidence, and this court has already examined testimony that contradicts the allegations. Bradford's expression hardened. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a federal matter now. Territorial jurisdiction doesn't supersede federal warrants, regardless of local sentiment or testimony. Elena stepped forward, her voice clear and confident despite the gravity of the situation. Marshal Bradford, before you execute that warrant, I have information about crimes committed by the person making these accusations, crimes that may include murder. The statement sent a ripple of shock through the room. James Washington's face went pale, while Marshal Bradford's eyebrows rose. With professional interest. That's a serious accusation, Miss Martinez. What evidence do you have to support such a claim? Elena had been preparing for this moment since her conversation with Samuel the night before. Mary Catherine O'Brien, a servant in the Washington household, disappeared under suspicious circumstances approximately 4 months ago. Her belongings were left behind, her family received no word of her departure, and Mrs. Washington's explanation of dismissal for theft was contradicted by the girl's character and behavior. You can't prove any of that, James Washington interjected, but his voice lacked its previous confidence. Actually, I can, said a new voice from the courthouse entrance. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Cooper entering with a woman Elena didn't recognize, a tired-looking woman in her 30s with red hair and worried eyes. This is Bridget O'Brien, Cooper announced, Mary Catherine's sister. She's traveled from Colorado Springs with some very interesting information about the Washington family's treatment of servants. Bridget O'Brien stepped forward, her Irish accent coloring her words as she addressed the room. My sister Mary Catherine wrote to me every week for 2 years, never missed a single letter. Then suddenly, nothing. When I went to the Washington house asking questions, I was told she'd been dismissed for theft, but they couldn't produce any evidence of what she'd supposedly stolen. Marshal Bradford was clearly intrigued despite himself. What did your investigation reveal, Mrs. O'Brien? I spoke to other servants who'd worked for the Washingtons over the years. 3 girls had disappeared in similar circumstances, all accused of theft or improper behavior, all leaving without collecting their belongings or contacting their families. Bridget's voice grew stronger as she continued. And I found a doctor in Colorado Springs who treated several Washington servants for injuries that went far beyond normal household accidents. Elena felt her heart racing as Bridget's testimony supported everything she'd suspected about Victoria Washington's escalating cruelty. But she could see James Washington conferring urgently with the federal marshals, no doubt offering alternative explanations and emphasizing the authority of his paperwork. This is all very interesting, Marshal Bradford said finally, but allegations of past misconduct don't invalidate current federal warrants. Miss Martinez, you'll need to return to Colorado Springs to face these charges, regardless of other investigations that might be launched. Elena felt the moment slipping away, felt the trap closing around her despite all their preparations and community support. But then Samuel stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard and respected. "Marshal Bradford, before you execute that warrant, there's something you should know. Elena Martinez and I were married by proxy yesterday evening, with proper territorial documentation." Samuel withdrew a marriage certificate from his vest pocket, the official seals and signatures clearly visible. "As her husband and a property-owning resident of Wyoming Territory, I'm claiming my legal right to have my wife's case heard in territorial court before any federal extradition takes place." Elena stared at Samuel in amazement, realizing he'd somehow arranged the proxy ceremony without her knowledge of the legal maneuver that bought them precious time while still honoring their commitment to marry in person today. Marshal Bradford examined the marriage certificate carefully, his expression growing more frustrated as he recognized its legal validity. "Mr. Hayes, this complicates the situation, but it doesn't eliminate federal jurisdiction entirely." "Perhaps not," Judge Harrison interjected, "but it does require a formal hearing to determine whether territorial or federal authority takes precedence in this case. I'm scheduling such a hearing for 1 week from today, which gives all parties time to prepare their arguments and evidence." James Washington's face flushed with anger. "You people can't keep obstructing justice indefinitely. My aunt has powerful friends in Washington, connections that go all the way to the territorial governor." "Then let her use them," Elena said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. "Let Victoria Washington explain to federal authorities why she put metal fragments in servants' shoes, why multiple young women have disappeared from her household, why she's so desperate to silence one person that she's willing to involve federal marshals in what amounts to a personal vendetta." The room fell silent as Elena's challenge hung in the air. She could see doubt creeping into Marshal Bradford's expression, could sense him beginning to question whether he was being used as a tool in someone else's revenge scheme rather than serving legitimate justice. "Marshal Bradford," Samuel added, "I invite you to remain in Cedar Ridge for the week leading up to the hearing. Talk to our citizens, examine the evidence we've gathered, meet with the other victims who are beginning to come forward. Judge for yourself whether Elena is a criminal fleeing justice or a victim seeking protection from systematic abuse." Bradford nodded slowly, his professional instincts clearly warring with the political pressure he'd undoubtedly received to resolve this matter quickly and quietly. "Very well. The hearing will proceed as scheduled. But Miss Martinez, Mrs. Hayes, you'll remain under territorial jurisdiction during this period. Any attempt to flee will validate the federal warrant immediately." As the various officials dispersed to prepare their cases, Elena found herself alone with Samuel in the courthouse corridor. The proxy marriage had been a brilliant legal maneuver, but it also meant they were truly married now, bound together not just by love but by law. "Samuel," Elena said quietly, "you married me without my physical presence at the ceremony. Are you sure that's what you wanted?" Samuel took her hands in his expression gentle but serious. "Elena, I would have preferred to marry you in person, with all the traditional ceremony and celebration. But when I saw those federal marshals this morning, I realized we needed every legal protection available. The proxy ceremony is valid, but it doesn't replace what we're about to do here." Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers, his robes marking the formal nature of what was about to take place. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, are you ready to solemnize your marriage vows in person?" Elena looked at Samuel, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of love, determination, and hope that she felt in her own heart. "Yes, Your Honor, we're ready." The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with Elena and Samuel speaking traditional vows while Sheriff Cooper and Mrs. Brennan witnessed their commitment. When Judge Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, Elena felt a sense of completion that went beyond legal formalities. She was choosing her future with full knowledge of the challenges ahead, entering into partnership with a man who valued her strength rather than her dependence. The week that followed their public wedding ceremony passed in a blur of preparation and testimony gathering. Marshal Bradford proved to be a fair-minded investigator who became increasingly troubled by what he discovered about the Washington family's history. Bridget O'Brien's evidence was supported by testimony from two other families, whose daughters had worked for Victoria Washington and disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Dr. Marcus Henley, the Colorado Springs physician Bridget had mentioned, provided detailed medical records of injuries he'd treated in Washington. Servants' injuries consistent with deliberate torture rather than household accidents. A cobbler came forward to testify about the special shoes Mrs. Washington had commissioned, describing how she'd insisted on metal fragments being sewn into the sawless, despite his protests about their obvious potential for harm. Most damning of all was the testimony of Sarah Mitchell, the servant who'd preceded Elena in the Washington household. Sarah had been located living under an assumed name in Denver, terrified to speak publicly but willing to provide sworn testimony about the escalating abuse she'd witnessed and experienced. As the evidence mounted, James Washington's confident demeanor crumbled. His threats about federal connections and political pressure proved empty when confronted with documented proof of systematic criminal behavior. Victoria Washington herself remained in Colorado Springs, too ill to travel but also too proud to negotiate or admit wrongdoing. The territorial hearing became a sensation, drawing observers from throughout the region who came to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Elena's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, her composed recounting of months of deliberate torture, contrasting sharply with James Washington's increasingly desperate attempts to paint her as a vindictive criminal. When Judge Harrison delivered his verdict, his words carried the weight of legal precedent and moral authority. This court finds that the federal warrant against Elena Hayes was obtained through fraudulent accusations and deliberate misrepresentation of facts. Furthermore, this court finds sufficient evidence to recommend that federal authorities launch a criminal investigation into the activities of Victoria Washington and her associates. Elena felt tears of relief and vindication streaming down her cheeks as the courtroom erupted in applause. But more than personal victory, she felt the satisfaction of knowing that other potential victims would be protected from Victoria Washington's cruelty, that Mary Catherine O'Brien and the other missing women would finally receive the justice they deserved. Marshal Bradford approached Elena and Samuel after the hearing concluded, his manner respectful and apologetic. "Mrs. Hayes, I owe you an apology. I was so focused on the federal warrant that I failed to investigate the circumstances behind it properly. You've shown remarkable courage in standing up to people with significant power and resources. Thank you, Marshal Bradford. But the real heroes here are people like Bridget O'Brien and Sarah Mitchell, women who risked their own safety to ensure the truth came out." 6 months later, Elena stood on the porch of the ranch house that was now truly her home, watching Samuel work with a young colt in the corral. The Wyoming spring had transformed the landscape into a carpet of wildflowers, and the air carried the promise of new growth and fresh beginnings. Victoria Washington had died in her Colorado Springs mansion, her reputation destroyed and her wealth unable to purchase the respect she'd craved. James Washington faced federal charges for his role in the conspiracy, his threats and intimidation tactics finally bringing consequences. He couldn't escape through family connections, but Elena's satisfaction came not from her tormentor's downfall, but from the positive changes their fight had created. The ranch had become an unofficial sanctuary for women escaping abusive situations, with Elena and Samuel providing temporary shelter while helping victims connect with legal resources and supportive communities. Elena had also discovered a talent For writing, documenting her experiences and those of other survivors in articles that were published in newspapers throughout the territory. Her writing helped other women recognize abuse and seek help, while also educating communities about the reality of domestic violence and the importance of supporting victims rather than blaming them. "Mrs. Hayes," Samuel called from the corral, using the formal address that never failed to make Elena smile. "Would you like to try working with this young horse? I think he'd respond well to your gentle approach." Elena walked toward her husband, her steps confident and pain-free in the comfortable boots she'd made specifically for her feet. The scars from Victoria Washington's torture were still visible, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her history, proof of what she'd survived and overcome. "I'd love to," Elena replied, slipping through the corral fence. To join Samuel with the skittish colt. "What's his name?" "Freedom," Samuel said with a smile. "Seemed appropriate, given everything we've been through." Elena laughed, the sound carrying across the mountain valley like music. Freedom indeed, not just from Victoria Washington's cruelty, but freedom to choose her own path, to build a life based on love rather than fear, to use her experiences to help others find their own strength and courage. As she worked with the young horse, Elena reflected on a remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From a broken woman walking on metal fragments to a confident advocate helping other survivors, the transformation had required courage she hadn't known she possessed, support from people who chose compassion over convenience, and the discovery that healing was possible even after the worst kind of trauma. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the promise of storms to come, but Elena no longer feared the future. She'd learned that freedom wasn't something that could be given or taken by others. It was something that had to be claimed, defended, and shared with those who needed to believe that change was possible. Standing beside her husband in the warm spring sunshine, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, Elena Hayes knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, not because someone else had chosen her fate, but because she'd had the courage to choose it for herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.